And I thought it might be good by way just to take a couple of minutes to kind of review where we've been, but really beginning in a couple of verses there in chapter 6, 12 and 13, and then through 7 and 8 and 9 and well into 10, we really, there's several topics in these chapters, but they all center also on the overall theme of Christian liberty. What is liberty anyway? What does the word liberty mean? Freedom to do. Yeah, that's right. Freedom to act, freedom to do, freedom to act. And so when we think about Christianity, unlike some other religions in this world, Islam for instance, Christianity is a religion of freedom. And that's why, frankly, if you are interested in political science or world history, if you have a Christian worldview, then you understand that the only reason that a government like ours functions or can exist is in the context of Christianity. It will not work because people, if you're going to give people freedom, they have to do what? They have to be able to do what? Self-regulate their own conduct. And when people refuse to control themselves, there will be an outside force that controls them. Usually governmental, communistic, Islam, whatever it is. But when we let our passions get the best of us and we don't use our freedom positively, we will lose it. But Christianity is a religion of freedom. Negatively, we are not free from what as Christians? What are we not free from? Number one. Now, we're free from sin. That's positively. Negatively, we are not free from what law? Are we under a law? Yes. What law is it? This is not complicated. The law of Christ, right. We are under the law of Christ. 1 Corinthians 9:21, Galatians 6:2. We're not free from the law of Christ. We are not free from individual responsibility. 2 Corinthians 5:10 says what? All men will do what? Appear before who? The judgment seat of Christ to do what? Receive the things they've done. We're not free from individual responsibility. We're not free to do as we please. Now that's the idea of Americans. Most modern Americans have a freedom or liberty. It's not the idea that the founders had. Most Americans believe liberty is the freedom to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, whatever I want to do, anytime. That's license. That's not freedom. Because it comes with no individual responsibility. We are free positively from sin, Romans 6. We're free from the bondage of the law of Moses. We don't appreciate that as much as these Jews in the first century did. But we are. And the more mature we become in Christ, we become more and more free from the impulses to do wrong, or we should. We are free to do or omit things that have no relationship to our salvation, according to this book that Paul wrote. If it has no relationship to our salvation, we're free to do those things. But Christianity is also a very personal religion. Each of us has our own personal convictions. Some of them may be the same. Some of them may not be the same. And these individual convictions and freedoms, as they relate to matters that are indifferent and optional, must be exercised with what? Caution, care. And so the brother who has reservations about something, that is, his conscience will not let him participate in something, has to be careful to not be what toward others? Dogmatic, judgmental, binding his opinion on others. We generally refer to that as what? What do we generally refer to that as? Binding where God is not bound. What's the term we've used for many years? Antiism, generally. There are whole churches of people who bind or attempt to bind things that God does not bind. Eating in the church building or whatever it might be. The brother whose conscience allows him to participate still has to be concerned about the effect that his actions has on weaker brothers and sisters. We've been discussing that, right? And so we see all of these underlying principles throughout these discussions of individual topics. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, we saw that liberty is to be regulated by love. In this chapter that we've been discussing, chapter 9, we see that liberty must never hinder the preaching of the gospel. In chapter 10, liberty must not be the occasion of apostasy or be used to fellowship error. And so when I say in chapter 8 it's regulated by love, we're talking about our knowledge. We're going to be regulated such that we don't exercise our liberty to the loss of another brother's soul. Paul discussed that. We've already been over that. But now we're talking about this hindering of the preaching of the gospel. We've already been through the first 14 verses of this chapter. Paul lists and discusses things like he had the right to eat and drink. He had the right to be married. He had the right to be supported as a preacher. But he said, I didn't exercise these rights. And he's going to tell us why toward the end of the chapter. But you know what? He says the other apostles, they exercised these rights, did they not? He said, Peter, he leads around a wife. And these other apostles and teachers and prophets and preachers, they're being supported by the work. But he said, I didn't exercise those rights. And now I'm going to give you my motivation for not doing so. Now, notice, I think when we left off, we were somewhere in this section, verses 15 through 17, maybe 18. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done to me. I mean, that's the first thing somebody thinks, right? Well, I know why he's writing. He wants money. He said, I'm not writing this because I'm hoping to make money off of you or to get paid. I'm not demanding support. But he'd rather die than be robbed of his independence. It would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. And I think that's kind of where we left off last week. And we were looking at this idea of necessity, and it really could come from either internal or external pressures. But when Paul obeyed the gospel and accepted the Lord's charge to preach it, was that his choice? Did he have a choice in that? Absolutely. He had a choice in that. But, nevertheless, even though he had a choice, his preaching was an obligation laid upon him by Christ. Christ told Ananias, he said, I've picked him personally, right, to take the gospel to the Gentiles, and he's going to find out how much he has to do what? Suffer on my behalf. So Paul did feel a necessity externally because his marching orders came directly from Christ. Remember in Acts 13, the Holy Spirit told the church there in Antioch what? You separate from me who? Barnabas and Saul for the work that I have called them. And so because of that, he had no grounds upon which to boast or glory. And then we mentioned last week that it's possible that he also felt an internal compulsion or necessity because of what? most likely? What would have been that internal compulsion or necessity that he felt?
What he did.
Yeah, his past. Of all the harm that he caused before his conversion. But in this context, he says, if I had volunteered, there might be some room for boasting, but he said, I was commanded to do this. There's no room for boasting or glory on my part. And woe is me if I don't preach it. I stand to be punished. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. Then I could boast about it. I could glory in it. But unwillingly, that's literally, those Greek words are a play on words. You could say, if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if unwillingly, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. I'm a slave that's been given a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. But just because he's a slave didn't mean he didn't do his best. In fact, just the opposite. He gave everything he had. He saw this as a stewardship with which he had been entrusted. And the personal joy that he received in it was being able to take the gospel to people without them giving him anything in return. And yet I think we mentioned last week as we finished up this section, we wondered if, even though that was, Paul felt good about the sacrifice he was making, made him feel good. Don't know if that was best for them, though. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Look at verses 12 and 13. Truly the signs of an apostle were accomplished among you with all perseverance, in signs and wonders and mighty deeds. For what is it in which you were inferior to other churches? Well, certainly not with gifts, because, he conferred them on them. Except that I myself was not burdensome to you. Forgive me this wrong. In what way were you inferior? Well, I didn't take money from you. The more I read about these people, he probably should have taken money from them. Because they hadn't learned to do what? They hadn't learned to do what? Like Paul had. See, Paul didn't have any problem sacrificing for Christ. These people did. And we have to learn to be challenged in our giving. If you don't put anything into something, it doesn't mean anything to you. And we have to sacrifice for Christ. Our money, our time, our priorities, yeah.
It's like a spoiled child.
Yeah, spoiled child.
They're not going to appreciate anything.
So maybe he should have taken something from them. Maybe they would have learned a little bit. Maybe they would have appreciated it a little more. But now he gives us his, what was his mindset behind this? Why didn't he take from them? For though I am free from all men, verses 19 through 23, I have made myself a servant or slave to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Well, we've already mentioned that he's already made the point that I possess the same rights as everybody else. But I don't insist upon those rights. By the way, as most men do. I mean, there's not a day goes by that I don't turn on my TV and there's not somebody on TV screaming about their rights. That's not being Christ-like. I mean, we thank God every day that Christ didn't demand his rights. What if he'd have looked at Pilate and said, you know what, I think I'll demand my rights. And call 12 legions of angels, and we'll just settle this matter right now.
He knew why he came. We could not be saved had he done that.
But he didn't demand his, and Paul didn't demand his or insist upon his all the time. Now, that's not to say they didn't stand up for themselves. But there was something more important to them. So Paul enslaves himself to all men that he might gain more people to Christ. So, all he's saying here is that he conformed to the customs and manners around him. He didn't compromise the gospel. He didn't compromise the truth. He didn't do anything that violated the law of Christ. But he was willing to conform to those things that he could, to have common ground with these people. I mean, if you're a missionary and you go to a foreign country, what are you going to do? Aren't you going to observe the same, as much as you can, as long as it's not sinful? Aren't you going to observe the same customs and manners of the people? Unless you just want to alienate everybody and not convert anybody. So those things that were not matters of faith, he could be involved in. And he could become like those people as long as he could do it without compromising the truth or be involved in their sins, because he wanted to win more souls. Barnes says, nothing is ever gained by provoking opposition for the mere sake of opposition, or to simply be different. Right? And there are religious groups that go out of their way to be different. They want to be, as the King James says, peculiar. And that's not what the original language means. Doesn't mean the word peculiar as we use it. It means a people for God's own possession, a special people. So, we're not to be peculiar or contrary when we don't have to be. So then, to them that are without law, to them that are with the law, to those who are under the law, he's talking about the law of Moses, that I might win those under the law. To those who are without law, the Gentiles, but keep in mind, they're not without any law at all. They're under the law of Christ. Everybody is. We're all amenable to the law of Christ, whether we obey it or not. So, it's not permission here to do anything we want to, because Paul says, look, there's law. There's always law. Bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, Galatians 6:2. Antinomianism is the idea that there's just no law. And we have some that kind of pick and choose, when they want to be under law and when they don't want to be under law, right? Depending on what they want to do. So, if I don't like God's law on this issue or that issue, so for instance, divorce, marriage, divorce, and remarriage, I'll just decide that, well, I wasn't under that law right then, but now I am. Well, that's not the way it works. So to the weak, he became weak. Well, he's already talked about that, right, in chapter 8. Can't do that which is evil, but he says he became as weak. He gave up his rights so as not to violate, so they wouldn't violate their consciences and sin. Right? It's interesting to me here too. What is this overall? And BJ may have covered this a couple of weeks ago. But what is this telling me? If he says that to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak, having become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. I mean, if you look at chapter 8 and you look at these statements here, if these people are brothers and sisters that I'm leading to violate their own conscience, what does that tell me overall about salvation? I mean, as a Christian, It's not a once saved, always saved deal, right? I mean, otherwise, this whole discussion is meaningless. To have a discussion about leading other Christians to violate their conscience and then sin is meaningless. If you're once saved, always saved. But again, I mean, the whole thing's kind of silly because every book after Acts is superfluous in the New Testament. If once saved, always saved is true. I mean, every letter is written to Christians basically to encourage them to be faithful. Do this, don't do that.
Especially Hebrews.
Yeah. But all of them are. I mean, if you do these things, I mean, look at 1 Corinthians. Such were some of you. Don't go back to doing that. But yeah, Hebrews is a prime example. So, we have to be willing to make personal sacrifice and even of our personal rights sometimes in order to gain the reward. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Now look at this example that he gives. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Well, what race is he talking about? What races would you think, writing to the Corinthians, he's referencing? Probably the Isthmian Games, they called it. Corinth sat on an isthmus. They had some famous games there, held just outside the city. What does it take to become a champion in human endeavors? I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. Let's think about what it takes. You take whatever sport is your thing, whether it's professional soccer or football or baseball. If you watched UFC fighters last night, beating the tar out of each other. Or you like the Olympics? What do those people have to do to be that good at what they do? Well, the goal is to win, but what have we been talking about? What's Paul willing to do to gain the reward and help others gain the reward? Huh? Sacrifice. You think about the things they give up, and I know we all say, boy, I would like to do that, and I wish I could do that. Some of you, like when my girls were growing up, they played a lot of sports, and in fact, they were on traveling teams. Club sports. And the amount of time that takes even for kids. I think it started mainly with Little League Baseball years ago. These travel teams that would play 150 games over the summer. All over, they just go everywhere. And now they do it in every sport. And every sport is year-round, by the way, now. Volleyball, soccer, baseball, whatever it is, you can play it. If you want to be good at it, you play it year-round. You play it for school, then you play it for a club. But if you want to be the best in the world, you sacrifice a lot. You sacrifice time, you sacrifice family, you sacrifice social engagements. Just going out and hanging out, doing whatever you want to with friends. They spend hours daily training. Now that's the kind of comparison we're getting in these verses. You want the reward, Christian. Are you willing to sacrifice like that? They're just doing it for what? And by the way, only one gets the prize. It can only be one winner. One winner in this deal. Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is what? My Bible says temperate, but what does that mean? You're a world-class athlete, you're self-controlled. Diet, right? Sleep, exercise. Now they do it, now notice, they do it to obtain a perishable crown. And that's not a diadem, that's not a crown of authority. That's a Stephanos, that's a victor's crown, right? They do it to obtain a perishable crown. I was reading somewhere where when you say perishable, what were these crowns made of? Anyway. Yeah, they might be made of flowers, plants, and other things. How long do you think those things stayed fresh? Barnes says, depending on the particular games in which they were involved, that the crowns were made up of olive, pine, apple, laurel, or parsley. The day the garland was placed upon the victor's head, the wreath was probably fresh, but it didn't take very long for its color to fade and the decay process to begin. Further, now this is a point that needs to be made, that Barnes makes. Further, the prestige of his victory would last at best until when? How long do you get to be the champion? Till the next champion, right? Sometimes, and I know I'm getting older, but I've watched so many sports and so many championships, you know. College basketball, football, Super Bowl, World Series. You name it, I've watched it, and tons of them. And sometimes if somebody asks me who won something last year, I can't tell you. Now, I might could tell you who won something 20 years ago. It made an impression. I can tell you that in 2008, John Calipari blew the national championship for the University of Memphis. I can tell you that because I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. Yeah, I can tell you that. I can tell you that he ended that game with 2 or 3 timeouts in his pocket. But I can't tell you who won. A lot of times I can't tell you who won last year. Yeah.
I was door knocking once, and there was this elderly couple. They were in their 80s, and I went in their house, and they were Olympic gold medal winners that had met at the Olympics and got married. And when I started studying with them, they said to me, "You tell us what we have to do, and whatever it is, we're going to do it." And it goes way back to that mindset of whatever we have to do, we'll do it.
Well, you're talking about 2 people that had understood what it meant. If you win an Olympic gold medal, there's no telling how many hours.
They were just incredible Christians. Just incredible.
So the point, of course, is if people in this world are willing to sacrifice so much, go through such intense training just for a crown that perishes, then what does that say what our attitude ought to be? But we, he says, for an imperishable crown. It's eternal. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. That is, not without a goal. Paul's not running all over the track. Right? He has a fixed goal. And by the way, when I box, I'm not unskilled. I don't miss the mark. You know, good boxers, they know how to land punches, right? Paul says, I've developed my skills so as not to waste time. I can effectively run the race and fight these battles. I discipline my body. I think the King James says keep under, but that's what it means, discipline. And it means to discipline by hardships. Man, athletes go through, do you think there's times they don't want to get up at 4 in the morning? You think I tell you, when I played, I didn't play football very much. I played a couple of years, but I know this, practice was always worse than the games. You know, not every sport's like that. You know, baseball, you can enjoy practice and the games, but in football, games were a breeze compared to practice. They go through a lot. Bring it into subjection. That Greek phrase there is it's got in that word doulos that we use for slave. Doula go or something like that, but it just means I make it my slave. You know, most people go through life. You've got your spirit and you got your physical body. Right? Most people in this world go through life, and what part of them makes all the decisions? The spirit or the physical? Wherever their passions go, that's what they do. Physically. The physical dominates the spirit. Paul says his spirit should dominate his body and not vice versa. My body should be under subjection. It should be a slave to my will. Lest when I have preached to others, well, now that's interesting. You can't fall from grace. Now here's the great apostle Paul that says what? Lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become a castaway, or a good translation there in the New King James is disqualified. We're talking about races and athletic events. So, Paul says, my endeavors have not been without goals, without direction. I've disciplined my body. I keep it under subjection to my spirit, because I do not want to, after I've gone through all of this, I bring my desires into subjection to my will, suffer all these trials. I don't want to suffer all this stuff. I mean, how much we're going to see in 2 Corinthians what all Paul had been through. But you're going to go through all of that and then be lost? Paul says, I don't want that to happen. Which again begs the question, if Paul can be lost, if he can be disqualified, what does that say about me? Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. I sometimes hear athletes will say, I knew I was going to win. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you're in an athletic event at that level, whether it's collegiate or professional, yeah, you have to have that kind of mindset. If you don't believe you're going to win, you're not going to win. Okay? I mean, you got to have the mindset that I'm going to win, but that still doesn't mean you will. But you're right. I mean, that's the point. They all said they strive. He said, looking back in verse 24, those who run in a race, all of them run, but only one gets the prize. So no matter how hard you work, you might not win. Those ladies that won the gold medal, somebody else got the silver and somebody else got the bronze, and the others didn't get squat. Out of all that, and I'm sure many of those others trained just as hard as the ladies did that won. But as you point out with the Christian race, everybody gets to win. Everybody that's faithful. Everybody that's willing to put in the sacrifice.
Greg.
Yeah.
So I had my team run yesterday, and one of my girls, she's won several times, but she gets nervous every time. She fell at the very start of her mile race, very start, banged up her knee, something awful, got up, had to catch up to the group, and won at the very last second. Because athletes, if they train, like it says here in Scripture, they learn how to, one, get back up when they stumble, but two, to push through that pain. And as Christians, we need to learn to have that mentality of, yes, life's going to throw things at us. We're going to stumble. We're going to have pain. But if we've trained our body correctly, we can block a lot of that out and keep focused on that goal.
I mean, you think about, I think it's a good point. You think about all the football, soccer players that have had ACL reconstruction. You think about all the major league pitchers that have had Tommy John surgery. And they go through all of that and all of the rehab just so they can play again. And there's something too, and I think you made a good point. There's something too about certain athletes that we really admire that seem to have this will. You know, I've watched athletes. I've even watched college and professional athletes that I could tell gave up. They got to a point in the contest where they decided this was over. But there are certain ones, there's not a lot of, there's just certain ones that rise to the top. You know, I think of Michael Jordan as one of those that was so competitive, never gave up, and had an incredible will to win. I mean, that's the guy that wants, as he said, look, there are guys that we'll use basketball. There's a guy that wants the ball at the end of the game, right? Or there's a pitcher that wants the ball in his hand when the game's on the line or whatever, or quarterback. There are others who don't. Pressure's too much, right? And we're talking about, and Paul's one of those kind of people. I mean, he had that kind of willpower, that kind of focus. Yeah.
Yeah, there is sort of a really key difference here between the Christian race and these other athletic endeavors, and that's that all the competitors in this race, the Christian race, want everybody else to win. And they're trying to help them to win too, and Paul's doing that even in this book.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because we found that out. It was something we learned here. We'll end with this, because we're at the end of the chapter. We learned this when our girls were competing. The last couple of years, Greer was in high school. She got tired of volleyball, and she switched over to cross country and track. And cross country is a weird thing, because you go to cross country events, and all the parents and everybody there, no matter what school, is cheering on all the runners. It's a strange thing to behold, because when you play club volleyball or soccer, or you go to high school, even the parents on the same teams can't stand each other, because they just want their little Susie or Johnny to be the star. So it's all about who, my kid's not playing, his kid's playing, his kid's terrible. It's just all of that kind of stuff. And you go to these cross-country races, and they're all cheering on all the runners. It's an amazing thing, and I think that's a good point. I think that's more like the race that we run as Christians. You're right. Only one person can win in an Olympic event or whatever. And so, no, you don't want the other guy to win. Your fans don't want the other guy to win. But in this race, we're all trying to help each other win. We're all trying to help each other cross the finish line, and you know what? It doesn't matter what our time is. I mean, those kids, I would go to those cross-country matches, and there's always somebody that's just like, just unbelievable. But all those people are cheering on the last runner. They stay there and cheer and run beside them and follow them. It's really wild. And that's kind of the way it is with the church, with God's people. We're supposed to be cheering each other on.
Hebrews 11:12 right there.
Yeah.
11 witnesses cheering us on as we run the Christian race.
And of course, the people that are cheering the most are not people. The persons that are cheering the most are the Godhead. They're the ones that want it the most for you and for me. They want it more for us than we want it for us, to be honest.
Isn't the goal just to finish the race?
The goal is to finish, yeah. The goal is to not quit and to go get across the finish line. Yeah, because you're going to get that Stephanos. You don't have to be first. All right. We pick up at chapter 10.